Hi folks, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria and also of Easton Antique Arms, so I deal in antique weapons, and therefore I come into contact with a lot of obscure weapons, and this is part of my obscure weapons playlist. So today we're going to be looking at a specific type of knife, or short sword you could call it, which is associated with the Dayak people of Borneo. Borneo, that is partially Malaysia, Indonesia and Brunei. So the island of Borneo is fascinating for all sorts of reasons. To do with its wildlife, its history, but the Dayak people are perhaps most famous as so-called headhunters. Now, if you've never heard of the headhunters of Borneo, then they were essentially what it sounds like. They hunted heads. They were fairly warlike sets of people who were often in intertribal conflicts with each other. Very interesting types of conflict as well. They had a variety of weapons. They fought both on water and on land, in the jungle, and in some open spaces as well. But they were essentially very warlike tribes who were constantly in conflict with each other. And one of the things that they did during these conflicts was gather the heads of their opponents. They literally decapitated their opponents and kept those heads essentially as trophies. And this is kind of what they were famous for in the 19th century and referred to as the headhunters of Borneo. In fact, this practice of headhunting was kind of clamped down on by various colonial powers. So it's not something that has continued to the modern day, of course. But the weapons that they use some of them are more ritualistic and some of them are more practical. Obviously, for the most part, a lot of their primary weapons were things like spears and shields, but they did have certain types of sword, and one of the most famous of these is the Mandau. So here I have an original antique Mandau. Now I'm going to refer to this as a Mandau throughout this video, but in fact it does go by a variety of other names in other languages and dialects as well. So there were similar swords to this in different areas, were known by different things, and also these themselves do vary quite a bit. I actually have two examples here, so I'm going to show both of them, and they vary slightly in shape and design. They vary slightly in the materials that they're made of and the way that they're decorated and what they were used for. So we actually have a spectrum of use for these. Now I'll just unsheath this before I go on, so you'll get an idea of the sort of blade that we're talking about. Now I'm going to put the scabbard down for a second, simply so I've got a hand free. This is the sharp edge, and it is pretty sharp, I have to point out, but we'll talk more about the design of it here. There are some variations in the blades, but you will notice the characteristic feature of these Mandau are that they have no real guard to speak of. They have a hilt, if you want to call it that, or grip, that's made out of either bone or antler. Usually I think they can be made of horn as well, actually, but anyway, an organic material, usually animal, but allegedly can be human as well. We'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. So we've got a fairly simple and fairly small grip, and then we've got a blade which is sort of machete-like in that it is a cleaving chopping blade that broadens towards the tip. Now, if you read various internet pages talking about these blades, a lot of them, especially Wikipedia, will say quite categorical things about them having a convex and a concave edge. Well, in actual fact, these only have one edge, okay? Sometimes the back, which I would call the spine rather than the edge, sometimes the back is decorated with perforations and funky kind of shapes and stuff. But these are pretty much single-edged, and the single edge is usually either pretty much straight or very slightly curved like a saber, like this one, and sometimes you get more curved ones. Okay, so you do get more curved ones than this, but they pretty much all the ones I've ever seen all broaden towards the tip and essentially have what's a bit like a clipped back point, a little bit like a broken back sax, arguably even like certain types of Bowie knife as well. So the characteristic feature of these blades really is that, I'll just turn this around because this blade is not symmetrical in a way that I'll explain in a second, and it's a bit more interesting on this side. These blades are pretty much almost straight, mostly, with this characteristic tip shape. Again, sometimes there's decoration on the back, and then one single edge. Now, talking about the blade cross section, that's actually a specific thing which I don't see mentioned very much in descriptions online, so I'm going to kind of explore that a little bit here. Now, all of the original examples that I have ever personally seen or handled, and I haven't seen hundreds of these, but I've probably seen, let's say, maybe about 20 of them. They are not symmetrical in terms of the cross section of the blade. So with this blade, for example, if I just move a bit closer to the camera, you'll hopefully be able to see that it is flat. It's actually very slightly hollow ground, very slightly concave on this face, but it's essentially flat in terms of the grind, and then it has a bevel on this side. So it's asymmetrical in that sense, so looking down the blade here, it's flat here, and then the edge bevel is only on one side of the blade. And they have put a delineating line, a bit like a groove, basically, a little bit like a filler, but it's not for any weight reducing measure. It's just, I think, to make it look more fancy. But they put a line where the bevel begins, so you can see that it has a flat section and then an edge bevel with a line decorating that border. And you'll notice if you look down the base here, you can see the plunge grind where the bevel actually begins, and they put a little bit of decoration just where that is, where that starts. So that's something, that cross-sectional shape is something that seems to be quite common, perhaps even normal for these Mandau. And I will just pick up the other example I've got here, okay? And we find a very, very similar thing with this. And you'll notice this blade is actually decorated with engraving all the way up, but you'll notice that it is essentially flat on this grind, and then the edge bevel is only on the other side. So they're asymmetrical. Now, moreover than that, this is another thing I don't see mentioned very much at all in internet descriptions of these. Both of these examples, now I can't say this is true of all examples, but it's certainly true of these two. If we look down the blade, they are both curved in terms of almost like they've got a warp. Okay, now this could be accidental, but I know a number of people who say that this is deliberate, and this is to assist with the taking of a head. So quite simply, if you imagine that your blade is coming in this way, cutting, the fact that there is a slight bow to the blade means that it's going to bisect through a neck without interfering with the shoulders, because the hilt and the tip curve up and away from the shoulders, so you can take a head off cleanly with the blade curving away and cutting like this through the neck. Now, whether that is true, I presume also you probably cut from the back and go in at the spine side first and come out of the throat. This is my guess. Now, one thing we have to point out is that these, many of these were made for ceremony and for wear. So a lot of these have been made even in the 20th century, mostly in the early 20th century. Now, these examples in terms of date, it's somewhat difficult to date these, but I presume that these are late 19th or early 20th century. They clearly have quite a bit of age to them because of the way that there is wear and tear on the various components of the scabbards and the hilts. But anyway, the fact is that these seem to have kept their design. So even if they weren't still doing headhunting in the early 20th century, they were still making their Mandau swords in exactly the same way as they had been made for the last however long, probably 200 years, I would think, at least. So these are essentially seem to be specialized beheading tools. But that being said, there are simplified versions of these, and these were used as fighting weapons as well. They were used probably predominantly with a shield, but they were used as sidearms and worn by themselves as well for self-defense. They were therefore inevitably used against animals in hunting, and they were also used as tools to some extent, so they were probably used in a similar way to a machete some of the time. That being said, my personal opinion, based on the construction of these hilts and the ornateness of these hilts, is that these particular, if I just get you a little closer look, these particular very ornate designs with a huge amount of carving in them, I don't think would be everyday tools, because they would just take too much wear and tear. Now let's talk a little bit about the material and design of the hilts. You'll notice that these two are different. Despite the fact that they have a similar overall look, they are clearly made of different materials. Now, this one on my right appears to be made of horn, as far as I can tell, and this one on my left appears to be made of bone. That being said, I know lots of these are made of antler as well. It is possible that this is antler rather than bone, but I think it's bone looking at it. Very, very ornate carving, particularly this one with the white hilt. So I'll just let you have a little bit of a closer look at this, and you'll be able to see the extreme amount of detail that's gone into carving this. Really, really crazy. Anthropomorphic shapes, animals. I have heard that the type of carving that they use on these relates to what the material is that's been used in the construction of the hilt. So if you used an animal bone, you'd do animal carvings. If you used a human bone, and allegedly that was done, you'd do human, anthropomorphic rather, carvings, so human sort of inspired carvings. And whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I have seen a few people write that. Now you'll notice that there is some hair sticking out of these. We'll look at the scabbards or sheaths in a second. Now again, this hair, I've seen many people, and you notice that this one would have had a lot of hair sticking out of the end originally, and it's lost it because it's fairly old, I think. But you can see some hair sticking out here, some out here. It's lost the one on that side, some out the end. And this one's got it sprouting out of various holes, the top and the front and various places. Now for the most part, this seems to be animal hair, probably pig hair for the most part. But it is suggested that some of this hair is human hair as well. So again, it comes back to this, I think, quite macabre view from perhaps a kind of modern or a Western point of view, that human components may have been used in the manufacture of some of these. I've got no evidence that either of these, that's the case. The other thing that's very, very important to mention as well is this type of braiding or wrap here. Now this one is actually brass wire. Let's see if you can get a bit of a close look on that. And I think that they would have used whatever they had available. So this is brass or copper wire, braided, which gives obviously a good grip and helps keep the material together, prevent it from splitting. This one is rattan. Okay, so rattan is actually a far more normal wrapping material for the grip here, and again that helps prevent this grip junction from splitting. And if we go over to the sheaths or scabbards, you very often find, as you can see up here, you very often find rattan used to bind the two halves of these wooden scabbards together. And just to look at the construction of those for a second, they're fairly typical of well, lots of different types of scabbard construction from all over Asia actually, but essentially you've got two bits of wood, two slats that are hollowed out slightly to accommodate the blade inside here, and then as you can explicitly see with the back on this one, it has rattan binding which to hold those two halves together, and this rattan is clearly very old and has disintegrated to some degree. And then on the outer side, because obviously this would be worn against your body, so this side's undecorated, and then the side that would be facing outwards, you have lots of decorative plates. And it must be said that some of these have almost a container or another sheath built into the outside face, and that has a knife, like I guess a typical utilitarian or perhaps skinning food preparation knife, which sits in the front, a buy knife essentially, which sits in the front of the sheath. So that is the Borneo Mandau, which is, I consider, a pretty obscure weapon. They don't receive an awful lot of attention, and I don't think that they're hugely studied. And some of them are made of quite interesting, locally forged iron deposits, basically forged into steel blades, and they seem to be pretty damn good quality steel actually. They retain a very good edge. Both of these are pretty damn sharp. I could go and cut up anything I wanted to with either of these right now. They're small and nimble things used by people who are, for the most part, not wearing an awful lot for combat, or as we've said, beheading in some situations. So for that reason, some people are kind of put off by them because they're seen as quite macabre and distasteful, shall we say, which is silly really, because that ritual is no different really to people killing each other in war. But anyway, there we go. Very interesting cultural artifacts, and it would be great to see these a little bit more widely known and acknowledged. They're actually not difficult to collect. They're not obscure in terms of there's quite a lot of them around, but they're just obscure in terms of the fact that not many people talk about them or know about them, in fact. So hopefully I've helped change that in my little part. So there we go. There's the latest in the obscure weapons series, the Borneo Mandau, or Dayak Mandau. And if you have any ideas for another weapon that you would like me to try and procure and talk about in my obscure weapons series, then of course you're very, very welcome to post your ideas below. Any other points you want to make about these Mandau swords, very interesting, very interested to hear those. I'm in no sense an expert on these or even weapons of that area. So I've told you what I know about them and what I've observed about them, some of which, especially to do with the blade cross section, I don't see many people talk about online anyway. Yeah, if you know more about them or other points you want to make about them, observations about the Dayak and about their warfare and other weapons they used, very interested to hear those as well. If you're not subscribed, please consider doing so and click that notification bell so you hear about new videos coming out. And I'll see you really soon again on the channel for another video. Cheers, folks.